This is Rich Mack from Colorado, now residing in Phoenix, welcoming you to the California Dreaming Podcast. Listener discretion is advised, but do have sweet California dreams. Take it away, Roseanne.
California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. You know, there is a little bit more to making a podcast than just talking into a mic and hitting publish. You need more than that. And I'm talking about a reliable hosting service so your time can be spent working on your show. You also want accurate download numbers, you want to see the audience that you're reaching, and you're going to want a webpage that is simple and easy to work with. That's why I choose BLUBRRY. With its simple media hosting and fully integrated WordPress website, it can't get any easier. So if you host a show or if you're thinking about starting one, visit www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to give BLUBRRY a try for a month for free. BLUBRRY's support team will be right there every step of the way to help you migrate over so you won't lose any of your subscribers in the process. And if you're brand new to this, they can get your new show up and running. And with a month for free to try it out using promo code DREAM, what have you got to lose? There are a number of ways that you can support California Dreaming. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can spread the word about the show. You can recommend us in podcast and true crime fan groups. And you can leave the show a rating and a review on iTunes or whichever platform you listen to the show on. And if you would like to go a little above and beyond, you can support the show on our Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to one exclusive episode per month, and there are currently more than 30 episodes that you can binge, so it's a pretty good deal for just $1. This week, I would like to thank Christina A., Helen W., Raina A., Maya F., and Shadira M. for joining Patreon. I'd like to thank Sylvia and Diane for raising their pledge up to the next tier. And I would like to thank Jill and Rebecca for making a donation through our PayPal. And if you would like to make a one-time donation, you can do so through PayPal using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Every little bit helps keep us going and keep us ad-free, so thank you. I'm starting the writing and research on this episode just after finishing the Patreon bonus for the month of January, and that ended up being somewhat of a lengthy discussion. It is a vacation series bonus that was recommended to me, and it's about the 2003 drowning death of newlywed Tina Watson as she was diving in the Great Barrier Reef off the eastern coast of Australia with her husband. But instead of regurgitating the facts and circumstances of the case, I decided to take a closer look at the couple themselves, Gabe and wife Tina, as well as their families. To tell you the truth, I came away with a very different view of the entire story than when I first started. Because the biggest question hanging over the case for me was why that tragedy happened the way it happened. Why so soon after the couple got married? So if you are a patron of the show, you have access to that episode. It's available for all supporters at all levels. And if you're not, it's only $1, and you could hear a little bit of a different perspective on the so-called honeymoon killer case. But for this week's regular episode of California Dreaming, we are bringing it back to California. And it's another strange case, another mystery of sorts, another death in water. But this time it happened in their own backyard. And I am way behind here, so I want to just get right into this 127th episode of California Dreaming, the tale of the other side of the fence. Have you ever been in a situation where you might be in your home and you suddenly hear or sense that something isn't right? Maybe it's a strange noise that causes you to sneak a peek out the window to try and see what's going on. It kind of happened to me here on New Year's Eve. I just got home. I think I had gone to the store to get some last-minute things before all the stores closed for the afternoon. And as I got to the carport, there were like 4 squad cars lined up all along where we park. And I was trying to be nosy without being nosy, and my next door neighbor was talking to the cops and another neighbor of ours, and I really wanted to join in the conversation, but I actually had no reason to stick my nose into the business that was going on. So I went inside, and then I came out the back quietly behind my fence and tried to listen. But the dogs were being barky little jerks, so I couldn't really hear anything at all, so I gave up. Well, in our story today, it begins with a neighbor who thought she heard something strange over on the other side of the cinder block wall that separated her backyard from her neighbor's. It was pretty early in the morning, so usually there isn't so much commotion going on. So she decided to peer through the top breeze blocks of that cinder block wall to see what, if anything, was going on over there. And what she saw, or what some say she thought she saw, what she says that she knows she saw, would be hotly debated. But we'll come back to that. Chris and Christi Hall met in 1978. Christi was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, but she was raised in San Bernardino, California. She was only 17 years old at the time when she went to visit a family member who was stationed at a nearby Air Force base. She was making her way past security and she by chance encountered one of the guards, who she said at the time kind of looked like Elvis. This was Christopher Hall. He was 20, she was 17, and after a little bit of small talk and back and forth, they decided they wanted to get to know one another a little bit better. It didn't take long for Christi to fall in love, and in short order, they were married. And within a few years, they grew their family with the arrival of 3 uniquely lovely girls. Courtney came along in 1984, Brianna in 1986, and Ashton in 1988. You know, they are sisters, but each of them were so different when it came to their complexion and to their hair color. One was blonde, one was brunette, one was a redhead. So if you didn't know they were sisters, you would think that they were best friends or something. And they grew up together in a loving home that was solid, held together by the incredibly strong union between their mother and father. Christi was a radiologic technologist at Arrowhead Regional Medical Center, and her daughters would describe her as the glue of the family. She was vivacious, outgoing. She got along well and was popular, not only with her coworkers, but also with the community that she served. And her family was the most important thing in her life. Her husband, Chris, was a little bit more laid back, and they made for a pretty good mixture, their 2 personalities. It brought them this sort of equilibrium that just worked. Chris had been a San Bernardino police officer up until 1994, when he was shot in the leg while working an undercover sting operation. From there, he and the family relocated to Idaho, where he took the job as chief of police in 2 small towns. By 2005, Christi and Chris were planning to start the next stage in their lives. The youngest of their girls was about to finish high school and head off to college, and they were getting themselves geared up for retirement. So they decided to settle down back in California, in the city of Cali Mesa. It is located in Riverside County, but is literally a stone's throw away from San Bernardino County. And one of the reasons the Halls settled on this home was because of the spa and the pool that was in the backyard. By 2007, according to the Hall girls, their mother was happier than she'd ever been in her life. There was one particular evening that spring when she had had a heart-to-heart with her middle and youngest girls, and it was just a moment where she expressed how delighted she was to have them in her life and their dad and their retirement home. It was just a really unforgettable conversation. Her life, according to the girls, was so fulfilled. The Halls were keeping busy making the changes that they had envisioned for their home when they settled on purchasing it. It was an older home, and there were some updates and renovations that needed to be completed. And on June 7th, 2007, the bathrooms were out of commission. They were taking both bathrooms, knocking down the wall, and combining it into one big bathroom. They were having both of the showers retiled and a brand new tub put in. So what they decided to do on that particular day was to get up a little early before the contractor got there to work on the bathroom and to go outside in their swimsuits and towels and rinse off in the spa. The work was scheduled to begin at 6:45, so they wanted to get out there and be done and ready before the contractor got there. During this time, their eldest daughter, Courtney, was still living at home. Chris got up first. He went outside to turn on the spa so that it would warm up. And it wouldn't take too long. This was close to summertime, and the nights out in Riverside are still quite warm. He went back inside and called his middle daughter, Brianna, who was away at college in San Diego. It was his daily wake-up call to her, just to make sure she got up and got going on time. He then tried to get Courtney up, but the first time, she completely dozed back through it. And while she continued to sleep, Chris and Christi went out into the backyard to get into the spa. A little after 6:30, Chris said he went back inside to check if Courtney was up yet. He called her name again and then went back outside. And then, just 7 minutes later, just as Courtney was starting to make her way out of bed and into her robe, she suddenly heard her father screaming in a panic. He screamed her name. Courtney hurried down the hallway and back out the door just in time to see her dad struggling to get her mother out of the spa. She quickly dialed 911 while she simultaneously tried to help her father pull her mom out of the water. Of this moment, Courtney would describe it as the worst of her life. To see her mom like that and her dad in complete hysterics. Nobody can quite grasp what that feels like unless you've had this experience. It was the first time she'd ever seen her dad unable to take control of a situation. Having been a career law enforcement officer, he has been through many situations similar, if not worse, than what they were facing in that moment. Yet when it's happening to you, to your loved ones, even the most seasoned police officers are certain to have a similar reaction. It was undoubtedly terrifying. Courtney called 911, then she ran to the front, opened the front door, and opened the gate and ran back to help start giving her mom CPR. When she had gone back there, her dad had not yet began. He was quite emotional, so much so that when first responders arrived, he was actually more of a problem than being helpful, to a point that they even had trouble getting him away from Christi so that they could help her. To his daughter, it was his sheer desperation to stay with his wife, to be close to her, to call out her name in the hopes that she would respond. For the next 20 minutes, the paramedics did all that they could to revive her, but it was to no avail. They were never able to get her breathing, never able to restart her heart. Courtney looked on, filled with fear, anxious to see any sign that her mom might somehow come back, but she didn't. Christi was taken by ambulance to a local hospital where later she would be declared dead. Dead as a result of a tragic drowning in her own backyard. What nobody knew at the time was that there was someone on the other side of their backyard wall that had heard something going on before 7 in the morning and decided to peer through the breeze blocks of that wall that divided their properties. And she knew, or at least she thought, that this was not simply an accidental drowning. Courtney had called her sister Brianna, who was attending school in San Diego. She didn't say much, but from the way it sounded, she knew it wasn't good. All Courtney could say was, "Mom has had an accident, just get here right away." So Brianna, knowing nothing more than that, got into her car and started making the 2.5-hour drive to Cali Mesa. Eventually, it would be Courtney who told sisters Brianna and Ashton the devastating news, that their mother was gone, just a year shy of having been happily married to their dad for 3 decades. But neither Dad, Chris, nor Courtney would be able to be there with Brianna and Ashton. They couldn't be at the hospital either with their mom, because they had to be taken over to the police station so they could provide their statements as to what occurred, and they would be spoken to separately. Courtney quietly cried on the way over. As for her dad, he was driven in a different squad car, and on his way he had managed to calm down. Chris knew that the investigators needed to do their job. After all, he had been a cop himself for decades. When he got to the station, he was brought into a room to answer questions where he and his answers would be recorded on video. And he explained what happened, They had gotten up early and grabbed a cup of coffee. Christi tried to get Courtney up, but she wasn't getting up, at which point she went out to the spa. As she was headed out, Chris was headed back in. They had passed one another. He had checked in on Courtney to make sure she had gotten up. The contractor was on the way, so they needed to get cleaned up and dressed. And then he went back outside, and that is when he saw Christi floating face down in the spa. He yelled out for Courtney, and that is when they attempted to resuscitate Christi. The investigators asked him what he thought happened, and Chris said he thought that perhaps she slipped somehow and became injured, which caused her to become incapacitated, unable to get herself out of the water. That was the only thing that made sense to him anyway. Well, it was about this time that Chris was told that Christi had suffered a 3-inch laceration on her head, and it was clear to them that the injury was not consistent with a simple slip and fall. Chris was beginning to realize where this line of questioning was leading. But you see, dreamers, the officers were not going on their instincts alone. This wasn't just a hunch. This wasn't a conclusion that they were reaching because of statistics that say it's so. This was an angle that they needed to explore because of Lindsay Patterson. Lindsay Patterson? Who is Lindsay Patterson? Well, she is an information technology specialist in the United States Navy, and she also happens to be the daughter of Chris and Christi's next-door neighbors, the Pattersons. She was on leave and visiting her parents, and she too woke up that early morning on June 7th, around 6, and she too was enjoying her own cup of coffee. And while she was in the bathroom, and it wasn't even really located in that close of proximity to the Hall's house, but it was while she was in the bathroom she suddenly heard what sounded like a scream. A blood-curdling scream, and it sounded like a woman. She came out of the bathroom, and she asked her mom, Sharon, if she had heard a woman screaming. She did, but she attributed it to children playing in the pool next door. And Lindsay was like, yeah, no. Kids up at this hour, it's not even 7 in the morning, playing in the pool? Lindsay didn't think so. So she quietly went out to the backyard and over to the wall that divided their properties. It was much taller than her, so she needed to stand on the planter to see over it. And like I said, the top row of cinder blocks were breeze blocks, so she could peer through those without having to expose any part of her head to look into the yard. So as Lindsay peered through, she saw a man in the spa along with a woman. He had one of his hands on her head and his other hand on her back, and she was face down in the water. Lindsay's initial thought was that the man and woman were engaged in a sex act. So she stepped down from the planter and walked away for a moment. But still, something wasn't really sitting right with Lindsay. So about 90 seconds later, she went back over to the wall to get a second look. This time she could only see the man sitting in the spa. She could no longer see the woman. He was sitting there relaxing, and he had his elbows propped up along the edge of the spa, and he was just sort of glancing around the backyard. This whole thing still felt a little bit off to Lindsay for some reason. So she went inside and told her mom what she had seen and that she had this feeling that something wasn't right here. But her mom brushed it aside and told her daughter to quit being that neighbor, sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. But Lindsay wasn't going to be deterred. Something fishy was going on, and like any persistent, nosy neighbor, she was going to take another look. And it was during this third peek into her neighbor's yard that she saw the man getting out of the spa. He was in a big hurry to get out. She still can't see the woman anywhere. Lindsay also got a good look at his face as he quickly got out of the spa. but it was hard for her to put it into words, to describe the man's face, as it was a look she had never seen before, like he had been transported into a completely different realm. It was so unsettling. So unsettling was this scene that Lindsay decided to call 911. And the investigators questioning Chris about the events of that morning would confront him about Lindsay's 911 call and her statement as to what she witnessed that morning. Because what Lindsay had described and what Chris had described did not exactly match up. When Chris was providing investigators with his version of events, he did not yet know that there was someone on the other side of his backyard wall looking in on what was going on in the spa. And Lindsay had already spoken to police and provided her statement as to what she witnessed. Chris had no explanation as to why their stories were different. Should they not believe her story? Chris said that he wasn't trying to say that she was telling lies. She seems like an honest kid or whatever, but he doesn't know. He cannot explain what it was that Lindsay is saying that she saw. So dreamers, we arrive at one of the biggest questions of this case. What exactly did Lindsay see? Or better yet, did she really know what it was that she was seeing? So that evening, on that dreadful day that their mother drowned in their backyard spa, the Hall girls gathered together at home and grieved and cried and held on to each other for comfort and support. And they waited for their dad to come home from the police station. They really couldn't figure out what was taking so long. Perhaps it was standard procedure. It seemed excessive, though. He needs to come home. He needs to be with his family. And he needs to deal with and get through his own grief and sorrow. Eventually that night, the phone rang at the Hall house. It was their dad. He was sobbing as he was trying to get the words out. They think I hurt Mom. And the reason why investigators were thinking that was because when they compared what Lindsay told them versus what Chris told them, there was one critical detail that differed. It was the first peer into the yard that Lindsay made, when she said she saw the man with one hand on the woman's head and one hand on her back. Chris said that that didn't happen. There was never a time, according to Chris, that they were in any sort of position like that there was nothing that they did that would have had them situated in that way. There was no sexual activity, nothing of the sort. As a matter of fact, said Chris, he doesn't even think that they had any contact while they were in the spa, other than while he was pulling her out of the water. However, Christi's body told another story. She had wounds that were indicative of having been engaged in a struggle. And it wasn't just one gash on her head. There were two of them, along with some other questionable injuries. And investigators also needed to decide that who here was telling the truth. Who were they going to believe? Chris or Lindsay? At this stage in the investigation, one thing was starting to become clear. That this was not an accidental drowning. There was definitely much more going on here that had investigators very, very suspicious. Christopher Hall would not be going home that night to be with his girls. He was arrested. He was taken into custody and charged with murdering their mother, his wife. It was incomprehensible to the Hall girls. First, they've lost their mother. Now, they're losing their father, possibly forever. And the worst part of it all, that their own dad was being accused of killing their mom. The tragedy of it all had suddenly become twofold for these girls. And to Courtney, Brianna, and Ashton, the idea that their father did this to their mother is absolutely absurd. They knew their parents better than anybody in the world. Their mother and father were the love of each other's lives. Christi was everything to their dad. His world revolved around her. Their marriage was absolutely 100% happy. It was solid. Not a single sign of cracking or faltering, even after nearly 30 years together. There is no way their dad did this. Both of them were extremely happy. Their mother had just shared that heartfelt moment a couple of months earlier when she expressed how happy her girls made her and how happy their father made her. Christi just kept saying over and over how much happiness that she was filled with. And sadly for Brianna and Ashton, that would be the last time that they would ever see their mom. So that is the memory that has been seared into their consciousness. Their mother's complete and total happiness with life. And you know, dreamers, I say it so many times in many of these shows how I don't know the players in each of these cases that we cover. I don't know them. And I don't particularly like stepping all over somebody's feelings or discounting what they're saying about their loved ones, because of course they know them best. And I absolutely 100% believe these girls when they say that they know their parents were the love of each other's lives. There's no way that this could happen, that they were soulmates, that they were each other's worlds, etc. And those girls are so very lucky that they grew up in a home where their parents were able to make them feel that way. A loving home with two loving parents that were completely devoted to each other and to their daughters. But for us dreamers, we really can't sit here and look at this marriage with rose-colored glasses just because the Hall girls are hoping that we will keep wearing them. It's not that simple. Christopher Hall is not that simple. And his daughters may not want to acknowledge the other side of their father. Maybe they don't feel like it's relevant. But for us, looking at this case, it absolutely is relevant. If you listen to the most recent Patreon bonus, a huge component is when we consider how we felt about the so-called honeymoon killer Gabe Watson. It was his character. His character got under our skin. We're going to discuss a few issues with Chris's character here that will give us pause. It will get us thinking about what kind of person we're really dealing with here. So Chris would end up sitting in jail for about 2 months on $1 million bail. When his daughters received their mom's $750,000 life insurance payout, they used that money to make his bail. He would be headed home to be with his girls and to get ready to face trial. It is unusual for a murder suspect to be granted bail. The $1 million was probably thought to be high enough to keep him in jail, but because of the life insurance, the girls were able to meet the amount. Ironic, isn't it? That if Chris did murder his wife, that it would be her own life insurance policy paid out to her own children that would be used to get the man who did that to her out of jail, at least for the time being. But according to Chris's defense attorneys, this is a special case, and this is a special situation. I suppose they didn't think, with his home and his daughters there in Cali Mesa, that Chris would be a flight risk. So for the time being, Chris would be free on bail, which of course is the best situation he could find himself in to prepare for his case, to set out to prove to investigators, to Lindsay, and to hopefully a jury that Christopher Hall is absolutely innocent of what he is being accused. The one thing that can be said about the Hall marriage, there was never a single incident of domestic violence, ever, at least that anyone knows of. And what do Chris's attorneys have to say about neighbor Lindsay? Well, basically that she didn't get the whole story. She peered over the wall 3 times. She had 3 moments of an entire scenario to reach a conclusion. What she never saw was Christi getting into the spa, accidentally slipping, falling into the water, and striking her head on a sharp corner of the spa. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's across from the steps when you're getting into the spa. It's a corner that's adjacent to the pool that juts inwards into the spa. It's kind of decorative, and it's definitely something that would hurt if you slipped and fell right into it. And it really looks kind of like a bad design. I'll see if I could try and post a picture of it on social media. If you struck your head on this corner, you definitely get a large gash, and it could cause a person to lose consciousness. As for the scream that Lindsay supposedly heard, well, Chris's attorneys are quick to point out that she was in a bathroom that was on the other side of the house away from the Hall's backyard. That bathroom faced their front yard and the street, so that scream could have come from anywhere. And Courtney was just inside the house and she never heard a thing. Now, who's to say that Courtney wasn't yet awake? As we know, Chris and Christi had tried a couple of times to get her up to no avail. Some people sleep really deeply. My husband David is that way. You know, we have 3 dogs, right? Well, 2 of them, Fred and Ricky, they sleep in our bed with us, and Rhoda, she sleeps in my daughter's bed. And the reason is because during the night, when Rhoda is asleep, she gets very angry if any of the dogs moves or comes near her, to the point where she will fight them, and she'll start snarling and snapping and barking and growling. She does it every time. Every night when she's with us, she just loses it, gets so mad. And when she does, it wakes me up immediately. But not David. He just sleeps right through. And in the morning, he has absolutely no recollection of anything of the sort. But anyway, I don't know if Courtney was up yet or not, but I tend to think that she was still not yet awake, because by her own admission, as I pointed out at the beginning of the story, 7 minutes after Chris had tried to wake her up, she was just starting to make her way out of bed and into her robe when she heard her dad screaming in a panic and yelling her name. So based on the timeline Lindsay provided and the time that Chris said that he tried to get Courtney up, there seems to have been about 10 minutes or so since Lindsay first heard that scream. Chris's attorneys, of course, will stop short of calling Lindsay a liar. They just think that she simply misinterpreted what she saw that morning. And even Lindsay will readily admit that she too wasn't exactly sure what she was looking at in those snapshots as she had been peering over the wall that morning. She just felt in her mind, whatever or however she was processing what she was seeing, that something wasn't right. Something was off, and it started with a scream. A blood-curdling scream that just sounded like something terrible was happening to someone. And then there was the way that she saw the woman being held under the water. And there not really having been enough time for that woman to have gotten out of the spa to go back inside and to come back out and slip and fall and knock herself out and drown. Yes, Lindsay saw 3 moments in a series of events. And in the moment, she certainly wasn't thinking that she was looking at a man murdering his wife. I mean, her first thought was that they were having an intimate sexual encounter in the spa. But pretty much based on what Lindsay saw, Chris Hall was going to be made to face the charge that he murdered his wife. A wife his daughters insist he loved more than life itself. He truly, truly loved her. They were the best of friends. And this simply isn't possible. But the state of California, investigators, the prosecutor, they all think otherwise, that he absolutely could have and would have done it, and they've set out to prove it. From the outside looking in, Chris Hall comes across as a loving, devoted family man. He had once been a police officer himself, who has now found himself on the wrong side of the law. His daughters were unwavering in their support of their father. Even in the face of the suspicions surrounding him, they were adamant. He was innocent, and they were standing by him through and through. Clearly, these girls loved their dad, and he loved them, and he would not destroy their family like this. Not a chance. But the San Bernardino district attorney wasn't sold on it at all. He believed Chris Hall's grief, the hysterics that he was in when first responders arrived, all of that was a put-on. As a matter of fact, when everyone was desperately trying to save Christi's life, Chris was doing next to nothing to help. Courtney was the one who called 911. She was the one that started CPR after unlocking all the doors to let first responders in. She was the one helping Christi, not Chris. And then we come to Chris Hall's past. The district attorney did a little bit of digging and found some very serious issues in his background. And one of the running themes in Chris's life and career as a police officer is that he has had a documented history of making up stories, telling lies and fabrications. In 2000, while he was working as chief of police in Cascade, Idaho, Chris was convicted of the misuse of public money. He had embezzled $19,000, and he meticulously attempted to cover up his crimes, and he almost did. So not only did the prosecutor see Chris as a liar, but he's a good liar. And to him, it is a big tell as to the type of person Christopher Hall is. Chris would end up serving 10 months in jail, and any hope of ever working in law enforcement again was gone. So the prosecutor had that on Chris. He also had the Riverside County medical examiner who ruled the lacerations on Christi's head were not consistent with a single slip and fall followed by an attempt at a resuscitation, and the particular types of bruisings and injuries on her face and body were indicative of a homicide. There was also a clump of Christi's hair that was tangled up with broken pieces of her hair clip that had sunk to the bottom of the spa. And it was an amount of hair that would not be consistent with a fall, but rather having been pulled out in a violent struggle. And when it came to Lindsay, she was the star witness. But there were a few times when she seemed uncertain about how long it actually was that she was looking into the backyard and how long it was in between looks. But the one thing that Lindsay was able to do was to establish that there was indeed physical contact between Chris and Christi in that spa, and it was something that Chris had denied. So despite some minor discrepancies about how long she looked and how much time had passed between the first, second, and third looks, the important thing was that she saw Chris with his hands on Christi. Chris was given the chance to explain what Lindsay saw, or perhaps what she didn't see. Explain the physical contact between himself and Christi. Were they having an intimate moment? Were they sponging each other off? Anything that could explain what Lindsay saw. But Chris stuck to his original story, that there was no physical contact between him and Christi. So not only would a reasonable person have to take his word for it, that same reasonable person would have to brush aside what Lindsay reported she saw as being a figment of her imagination. And there was one other element to the story that gave Lindsay and what she saw even more credence. It's the fact that she told her story before anyone ever found out what happened to Christi. She herself called 911 a full 90 seconds before the 911 call from the Halls came in. In Lindsay's 911 call, she said, quote, "I saw him put her underwater and hold her there," unquote. And it was while Lindsay was still on that 911 call that Chris came outside to supposedly discover his wife unconscious in the spa, which she then relayed to the 911 operator too, when she said, "Okay, now there's screaming going on outside." To the DA, This would have had to have been the most astronomical of coincidences. For Lindsay to have thought she saw a man holding his wife down underwater in a spa, and for that to actually turn out to be what happened. Lindsay told 911 she saw a man holding a woman's head underwater, and lo and behold, that woman wound up dead as a result of drowning. But why though? Why is Chris sitting in that spa, one of his daughters just inside the house asleep, waiting for a contractor to show up to work on what was to be the home they were going to retire and grow old in? Why would Chris suddenly reach for his wife, grab her by the hair, breaking her clip, ripping out a clump of her hair in the process, bashing her head into the concrete edge of the spa not once but twice, and then hold her underwater until she drew her last breath? Then he puts this plan in motion to then use his 22-year-old daughter as an alibi witness while he puts on the act of his life, waking her up in a panic, screaming that her mother is unresponsive in the spa. If this is indeed the case, then Chris Hall is a truly heartless and cold individual, not only to snuff out Christi's life, but to drag his own daughter into his mess. But why? What was Chris's motive? Prosecutor doesn't have to prove it, but it doesn't hurt if he can point to a motive, which is a bit challenging in the case at hand. The prosecutor described Chris as having a moment of private fury, but beyond that, there is not a clear-cut reason why he would suddenly turn on his wife of 3 decades and drown her in their backyard spa. His girls would scream it from the mountaintops. Their parents were in love. They loved one another. Dad killing mom did not happen. But no matter, everything, at least to the prosecutor, points to their father having been responsible for killing their mother. 3 years after Christi's death, Chris Hall went on to trial, and the girls sat in that courtroom gallery for every single day of it. And they could not be more offended at the notion that all of these people in that courtroom accusing their father seem to think that they know their family better than the girls know their family. It was like a slap in the face, day after day, to be told that their entire lives were a facade, that their family was a sham, that their dad was this diabolical killer, that just all of a sudden had this hidden anger and violence built up in him towards their mother and decided on that morning to unleash all of it. And the defense? Well, they would say that this was nothing more than a tragic accident. A slip and fall into the spa. She went unconscious and drowned. Chris Hall had never been a violent man. He had never so much as raised a hand at his wife. There was no motive to be had. No reason to suddenly decide he no longer wanted Christi to be alive anymore. And this amounted to an accident. As for Lindsay, well, to the defense, she didn't know what she was looking at. And besides, if she saw Chris drowning Christi, then why did she not describe seeing Christi in the spa during the second and third peeks into the yard? All 3 of Chris's daughters took the stand in defense of their father, and all of them moved every single person in that courtroom. Their testimony shattered everyone emotionally, speaking of their mother and their father and their relationship, their love for one another, and how this just could not have happened the way that the prosecutor said it did. They were the 3 most powerful individuals in that courtroom. Of course they were. They were fighting for the only parent that they had left in the world. They would even say, if they thought for a minute that their father was guilty of this, they would have not a problem turning him in. That they would defend their mother just as steadfastly as they would defend their father. And it is not a normal thing for the prosecutor to be at odds with the family of the victim. Because on one hand, you're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to fight for justice for the victim. But in the eyes of her own children, you are this villain trying to take down their dad too. It's not an easy place to be, but it is a necessary place to be. The jury deliberated for 6 days before they sent up a note to the judge that they were hopelessly deadlocked. A mistrial was declared, but the prosecutor was not going to give up, and he promised to see Chris Hall back in court for a second trial. But he knew he needed to approach trial number 2 a little bit differently. And this is where the issue of character will come into play. Remember, we brought it up earlier. And there are some not so flattering things that are going to be uncovered about Christopher Hall, the former disgraced police chief. Okay, dreamers, this is an episode that can be squeezed into one part, but I am running short on time, so I'm going to go ahead and make this a 2-parter. When we come back, we're going to get into the second trial and all that testimony, the witnesses, and the things that the prosecution did differently this time around. So hang tight. I should be having part 2 up in a couple of days from now. I'm thinking Sunday or Monday. You won't have to wait very long. I hope you all have a really wonderful weekend. I'll do all the usual end of episode stuff in part 2, along with all of the birthday shout outs. So until then, sweet dreams.